So our next session is going to be on the fourth pillar, digital business strategies. And this pillar is headed by the co-founder, co-director of the Initiative on the Digital Economy, Andy McAfee. Andy and I have been working together, and it's been such a pleasure to have someone so smart to interact with and write books with. A couple of books now, maybe another one in the pipeline. And a big part of the reason that the Initiative Digital Economy is taking the shape the way it is because of the synergies Andy and I have had from working together. So I hope you guys benefit as much or a fraction as much as I have from him in the next, I guess we have an hour or so for the research in the digital business strategies. And he will go ahead and introduce the other people who are participating. So please join Andy McAfee. Join me in welcoming Andy McAfee.
Eric's introductions are getting better. He introduced me at a conference earlier this year, and he said, "Andy makes me feel smarter." I didn't quite know what to think about that, and he didn't understand why there could be any controversy about that. So I said, "Hey, Eric, you make me feel handsomer," and that got the point across. So thank you. Now that I couldn't agree more about the synergies and about finding a group of people who are just so deeply interested in the same things that you are and that push you and make you smarter on a daily basis. So it's, the IDE has been fantastic. I think today has been a demonstration of the caliber and the scope of the work going on at the IDE. This last hour, we're going to finish off with the last chunk of the pillar of work that we do here, thinking about business models, business strategies for a digital age. 3 out of the 4 talks will directly address that. The first one, this one, is actually not directly about business strategies for the digital age. I want to talk about an offshoot of some work that I did with these two colleagues, Lamar Pierce and Dan Snow. 2 years ago at this conference, I presented the work that we did that was about digital business. It was about what happens when a business suddenly gets the ability to monitor its employees, to monitor their micro-level activities to a much, much greater degree. And what we found was there was a surprising performance bump that resulted from that monitoring. We also realized we had the opportunity to, with that same body of data, look at another question that I find really interesting anyway. And I want to start by echoing something that a number of us have said today, which is that we have brand new tools and brand new microscopes to go look at a lot of pretty interesting questions, whether it's the spread of social influence or any of the other things that we have heard about today. This combination that we have of scads and scads of data, particularly since we have cloud platforms now, really powerful analytical tools, and geeks who are interested in a number of questions, gives us the ability to get much greater clarity and insight on a huge variety of questions. Some of the ones that I enjoy the most are not directly business questions, but ones related to our social lives or our economic lives. So the one that I want to talk about today is a little bittersweet. It's got a tough aspect to it, but I find it a really interesting question. What happens after a tragedy? How does our behavior change in the wake of a tragedy? In particular, do we become more generous, more altruistic, or not? And I want to ask you all what you think about this question. How many people think that we do become more generous in the immediate aftermath of a nearby tragedy? Hold on. Versus those of us who think that we don't. And before I ask for the show of hands, I want to be really clear. The definition of a tragedy up here is kind of important because we use that word too loosely. The Patriots losing to the Giants in the Super Bowl was a bummer if you're from New England. It was not a tragedy. A tragedy is really a much more devastating event, okay? And I'll define that more clearly in a second. So how many of us think that generosity does increase immediately after a nearby tragedy? Hands way up, way up. Okay, how many of us think that generosity would decrease in the immediate aftermath? Why do you think that is? I don't know, I just don't like people, so.
It's traditional philosophical, are people innately good or innately right?
And you think that a tragedy might make us withdraw and become more frightened?
Feeling that whatever happened to them, they need to start to conserve.
Start to conserve, so generosity would go down. Someone with a more altruistic cast of mind explain their vote? Christina?
A lot of these compete for our attention, and we might not be as altruistic as we like to think of ourselves because we're focusing on other things, and this becomes salient and kind of motivates us to pay attention to our values and act.
The things that matter in life, like being nice to other people, because life becomes more precious. So, see, this is why I find this a really interesting question. We have an ability to address this question directly with a ton of data. Let me talk about the data setting first, and then I'll talk about the sad news here. We have gathered a huge amount of really, really low-level transaction, every check, every item on every check, every tip on every check, for 2 different periods of 400 days, for about 1,200 different table service restaurants. And I don't know if Cheesecake Factory is in our data or not. This is the kind of restaurant that we should be thinking about. Usually part of a chain, usually not super high end, but they've installed this point of sale system that really puts just a microscope on all the transactions that happen in a restaurant. So we can watch this flavor of economic activity. The flavor of generosity or altruism that we're interested in is tipping, a pretty classic demonstration of generosity, one that still puzzles a lot of classically trained economists. Why would you ever leave in a tip in a far-off restaurant if you're not coming back? But we do it, and tips go up and down based on, I guess, how generous we're feeling. Okay, now comes the difficult part to talk about. There is unfortunately no shortage of tragedies in our society. The ones we concentrated on, and this is macabre and ghastly, and I apologize for it, are honestly mass shootings. And we identified inside our sample of data, we identified no fewer than 8 multiple homicides all across the country. Now, this is undeniably just horrific and tragic. It does give us an interesting research opportunity, because what we can do is take those 8 locations and look at what happened at the micro level at nearby restaurants before and after those tragedies occurred. And our basic approach was to take a 20-day slice before the tragedy, take a 20-day slice after the tragedy, and basically look at whether tip percentages increased right afterward, decreased right afterward, and then how quickly, if at all, they changed their trajectory. Does that basically make sense? Here's the map of those dire events as they occurred across the country, all within the past 3 or 4 years, all of them inside our panel of data. And the question we were primarily interested in was, what happens to tipping behavior right after one of these things occurs? And our basic research approach was pretty straightforward. Let's say we've got those are 4 restaurants. The top one is one that was near one of the tragedies. So only that top horizontal line is near one of the tragedies. That's a nearby restaurant for tragedy 1. So we take that first time slice when tragedy 1 occurred, 20 days before, 20 days after, and those bottom 3 restaurants are all controls. They weren't near a tragedy. That top restaurant is the one we're interested in, and we want to look what happens before and after that black line. Then there's tragedy 2 that occurs. We have 8 total. There's tragedy 2 that occurs, and I'm sorry, that second horizontal line is the tragedy 2 restaurant. Then the control versus the treatment group shifts. Restaurant 1 at the top now becomes part of the control. Restaurant number 2, which happened to be nearby that second tragedy, is now the one that we're interested in. So we're going to divide up all of our restaurants, clump them that way, and look at these 20-day periods before and after. And again, the main flavor of altruism or generosity that we're interested in is tipping behavior. And so by show of hands, most of us thought that tipping would increase, or this flavor of generosity would increase in the wake of a tragedy. What we actually find is something close to the opposite. So that black line, the red line, is the day when the tragedy occurred. And what we're looking at here is the behavior of the nearby restaurants versus the faraway restaurants. And what we notice is that right after the tragedy happens, that tipping behavior goes down. It rebounds fairly quickly, but that initial dip is a statistically significant dip. It's not huge in economic terms. It's not like suddenly people started tipping 3% as opposed to 15%, but it is significant in statistical terms. It is a noticeable drop in tipping, and then it comes back fairly quickly. That's what happened to all the restaurants within 50 miles, of which we had somewhere between 50 and 100 that met that criteria. If we broaden the radius out and we look at what happened within 100 miles, we see essentially the same kind of behavior. Tipping drops off. Again, not economically huge, but statistically significant. We see exactly the same thing if we broaden that out to 250 miles was the largest radius we looked at. We see the same kind of thing. we have our theories about what's going on here. Other people's ideas about what might be happening?
Certainly you may not be measuring what you think you're measuring.
I agree.
I would almost think that you'd be measuring degrees of insecurity or fear. That would naturally cause people to conserve their resources, the tipping being discretional money and therefore conserve the source. I would have thought to measure this giving after, say, a hurricane tragedy and whether or not folks are donating instead to the Red Cross. So I would be interested in that as a measure. I fear that the construct you're measuring is insecurity and not generosity.
Economic insecurity as opposed to generosity. So is it, you don't think a tip is a flavor of generous behavior? That strikes me as not dissimilar from generosity.
You're in a case where you might be in a position, if you're afraid of the environment, where you're going to have to protect yourself and will need the resources to do so.
Yeah, let's say I agree with that. My point is that this is, you don't agree that this is a measure of generosity then?
You've got a conflict, but you're getting two different things at the same time. And if you were to ask them if they're going to want to give, probably yes, but if you want them to have the resources to protect themselves, you're going to want that too.
I agree with that. I think that reinforces the strength of this approach. Talk is cheap, right? So espoused generosity might be going up. This flavor of generosity is going the other direction.
Andy, what did total receipts do for each location over that period of time?
You know the definition of a great question is one that you have a slide for, right? So there's change in demand. No discernible change in overall volume of going out to eat at these places.
The 20 bucks that you gave me to ask that.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that.
It's not like a function of how happy you are with the service.
So you think service decreased afterward?
What I'm saying is that, there is definitely, that kind of correlation. But I think, I give the higher tip from happier for the service. So it's like a good exchange, not just genetic. I don't think it's
Okay, so you don't like equating.
to the Red Cross, it's a gift. We don't want to have the cost, right?
Fine.
I think that a service that if they treat me bad, I'm going to give them a very low tip, no matter what they benefit.
Meaning after the meal, I'm happier, I give a larger tip.
Sure.
After the meal, I'm inherently sad and nothing is going to make me feel better. I'm just not going to tip.
Yeah, because I'm not happy with the service. So it's a price that you pay for the service, right?
But why do you think it would go down immediately after a tragedy then?
I think there is a component of insecurity. For sure. So you have less disposable income because you're less secure, right? So I think you want to protect your income.
If that were true, wouldn't we expect people to go out to dinner less?
I don't know, sometimes you just do the mirror for habits or because you don't have anything in the house. I think it has to be maybe a function, I don't know, but you can try to map it to, maybe that restaurant that day was less busy, so it was more attention.
We actually took busyness, day of the week, and restaurant chain into account.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what about the idea that perhaps people are tipping less because they're actually giving more to an actual charity that's helping them tragedy?
Andy, to rephrase his point.
Hold on, let's move around. Other? Yeah, please.
So I do think, I agree with what a lot of people said, that to associate tips with generosity in relation to a tragedy doesn't quite make sense to me. But since you said that there is a correlation there, what's interesting is when you're tipping, you're actually, you're actually paying part of the wage of that worker, because in most states the tipped minimum wage is way under the regular minimum wage, and as a consumer you're expected to pay that. So if this is actually true, it's yet another data point showing how unfair that system is, because it's showing the mood of the consumer, and maybe by something like a tragedy is actually influencing how much they're tipping their server, and not just how well that server did in serving that person. So it's kind of an interesting choice there.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead. In the back. Marshall, you can't hug the airtime.
I'm just wondering if the nature of the tragedy might be a factor, in the sense that if it's human related, right? If somebody goes out and does a shooting, you naturally have disdain and think people are shitty. But if it's a hurricane, it's nature, so it tends to bring people together. So I wonder if you'd see the same
That's interesting.
results, right?
So we could try to do this exact same thing with natural tragedies versus human. Maybe this decreases my milk of human kindness, whereas that's hard to think of after Hurricane Katrina. Fantastic. Okay, now Marshall.
I want to rephrase that exactly and reinterpret it. What you're doing, you're looking at an unremediated compensation. I wouldn't expect gifts to family in Africa to go up at the same time. To give you ultimate data, I'm willing to bet $1 or $100 that gifts to NRA, fighting NRA would go up, because that would ameliorate the tragedy, and this other thing doesn't ameliorate it. So it's an unrelated compensation in conjunction with the field.
Got it. So there's clearly more than one kind of tragedy. There's probably also more than one flavor of generosity. It'd be interesting to build a matrix of this. Yep, last point.
Real quickly, I used to work at a place that their phone number was 1 digit off from the Red Crosses. So in the wake of a natural tragedy, we got all kinds of wrong number calls because people can't spell help now. So I do know that people's at least intent to give does go up immediately after a tragedy. But you might want to look at something that's natural disaster but highly localized. So I would look at like tornado instead of hurricane.
That's a good idea.
Because a hurricane will hit an entire economic zone. A tornado hits this block and not that.
And we probably have data on exactly where tornadoes hit during this period. Yeah, I like that. So I think the natural versus man-made tragedy would be interesting here. And I'm not trying to make the case that every flavor of generosity is going to go down. I do find this an interesting case of a flavor of generous behavior that heads in the opposite direction from what most of us were expecting. My theory, well, there's another excellent question because we do have a slide on that. We didn't see any change in the other kind of misbehavior that we looked at, which is employee theft, no difference there, and total demand didn't change very much. So what do we think is going on? It appears that this flavor of generosity decreases slightly, rebounds fairly quickly. The explanation that we've come up with is really simple. A nearby tragedy bums you out, especially this human flavor. The fact that 4 people got shot 20 miles away lowers my mood. We tend to be less generous, less altruistic when we are less happy. However, other research shows that we tend to bounce back. Our happiness returns to its baseline level remarkably quickly, even after a dire event. I think that's what we're seeing in this tipping trajectory. Tipping lower in whether or not that, I don't know the answer to that. We can probably look at that with our data because our coverage is so good that we can correlate this with crime, with religiosity, with all kinds of things across the country. One of the kinds of work I want to do next is to look at this data and see if these kinds of behaviors are associated with crime, religiosity, other things.
Do you see anything statistically significant outside of the 50-mile radius? Like, so for all of the control restaurants, do you actually see the tipping go up? I'm thinking about a large-scale tragedy where people would see it on social media. And, if you're not close to it, maybe you feel some sort of empathy there. But if you are close to it, then you get this sort of PTSD.
All the non-close-by restaurants are in our control group. So this is purely a comparison of nearby versus not nearby. We didn't see any increase in the not nearby restaurants. Those were pretty, if anything, they were flat to, right? Almost no change in behavior there. Okay, now, if I've thoroughly bummed you out with tragedies and the lack of generosity thereof, let's move on to business models.